Hello and good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to see all of you today. You know, a couple of months ago, we had a wonderful session with Professors Jan Svenar and Andres Velasco, two remarkable academics who also took the bold step of running for public office. For President of the Czech Republic in the case of Jan Svenar, who is also now our Director of the Center for Global Economic Governance, a co-sponsor of today's event, and also for Andres Velasco, who, after many years at Harvard, teaching at the Kennedy School, ran for President of Chile last year. And it was a wonderful exchange to discuss whether you know, if you have a deep background in economics and the academy, how you could engage those ideas in public life, and in fact, whether your experience and training in the academy was a help or a hindrance as you have to engage with people in public life and as you run for public office. And I think that in the case of Jan, we heard about an election environment that was fraught with tensions and various kinds of risks and threats. And in the case of Professor Velasco, we had an image of him and his family renting a Winnebago and driving all over Chile and having wonderful conversations in a very engaged way in a very different election environment. But, you know, we're continuing this question of the engagement of the academy and deep scholarship and knowledge with public service, and that is a combination that I think we really value here at SIPA a lot. And we have a number of faculty who have been in high office and who go between government, public service, and SIPA and Columbia. And I think that brings enormous perspective to the teaching and the scholarship that emanates from SIPA and engages the kind of questions in public policy that we want a School of Public Policy to seriously engage. And so I'm really very, very delighted to be able to continue this engagement with an individual who I think has a remarkable background and history, and to have with us today Dr. Federico Sturzenegger, who is member of the Chamber of Representatives of the National Congress of Argentina and professor of Torcuato Di Tella, one of the nation's really leading universities, and of course is a very, very well-known scholar in his own right. And I'm told by our own Guillermo Calvo that he is really referred to, you know, as the leading economist in Argentina. So we're extremely grateful that you're with us today, and I'm really very proud to have you here with us and to welcome Professor Calvo to the podium to further introduce you properly. So thank you for being with us, and thank you, Professor Calvo, for bringing him to our campus.
Well, thank you, Merit. It's for me a great pleasure to introduce my friend Federico, sometimes called Freddy, who is now a member of the Chamber of Representatives in the National Congress of Argentina, and as Dean Jano said, also professor at the University Torcuato Di Tella. Now, normally, when you introduce outstanding people and everybody wants to hear the speaker, you go very shortly over his past. But in this case, it's important that you know some of the steps that he had taken, because that's precisely at the center of the presentation and discussion today. how an economist, an academic economist, an outstanding academic economist can become a politician and the challenges to do so. So let me say that he has a Ph.D. in economics from MIT, 1991, and then from that he moved to academia as an assistant professor of economics at UCLA from 91 to 95. Then he became the chief economist of YPF, the now famous YPF, that has been recently nationalized by Argentina. Then he went back to academia as dean of the business school at Di Tella University, but obviously that was too boring for him, and went back to politics as Secretary of Economic Policy of Argentina in 2001, a rather complicated year for the country. And from then he became a visiting professor of public policy at the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, from 2005 to 2007, and back again to policymaker. He became a president of Banco Ciudad, which is the city, the municipal bank of the Buenos Aires from 2008 to now 2013, when he became a representative. Now, in addition to his travels through these different institutions, he has under his signature, he has written or edited 8 books and published extensively in international finance and macroeconomics. In recognition of that kind of work and contributions, he been named the Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum in 2005. That's more on the policy side, and also has received a Konex award for his contributions to economic theory. So here we have somebody who really straddles the two ends of the profession, and as you will see, he's an excellent speaker. I'm delighted to welcome Federico. Please join me in welcoming him again.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. If there's one leading economist in Argentina, it's Guillermo Calvo, who has been for all of us a teacher and someone that we have referred to over hello, how are you? Over the years, so it's particularly a pleasure to join Guillermo today and to be with all of you here. Well, the talk is about going from academics to politics, so maybe I should start with perhaps one thing that happened to me last year when I was doing the campaign. I go to the first big electoral debate last year. There were going to be 3 big, on TV, you know, the thing when you start up on a podium with 2 other guys. And I was on the first of those debates, so I get my coaching from our political advisor, which is a guy called Jaime Duran Barba. Maybe you've heard about him. He's a very famous political consultant in Latin America. And he says, look, I want to ask you to do 4 things in this debate. You just do 4 things, and you'll be okay. We'll all be okay. And okay, fine. So what are those 4 things? Well, the first one is don't propose anything. Don't propose anything. I mean, what do you mean? I've prepared myself for 35 years to go to Congress and propose things. No, people are not particularly concerned about that. So just don't waste your time. That's not relevant for people. So please forget about proposing anything. Okay. What's the second thing? And he says, the second thing is don't explain anything. What do you mean don't explain anything? There's, for example, one of the blocks of the debate was going to be on inflation, which is very high in Argentina today. And says, what am I going to do if I can't explain why? No, because if you explain inflation, then they're going to say that you're going to explain that money printing generates inflation, and that you have to reduce money printing, and if you have to reduce money printing, that means that you're going to do a fiscal adjustment, and a fiscal adjustment means people will lose their job, and we don't want you to kind of say that. You just, when you're in government, do whatever you think has to be done, but not right now in the middle of the debate. So I say, what do I do? What do I say? Just tell that they're lying with inflation numbers, or say whatever, talk about your kids. It doesn't matter, okay? So anyway, okay, that was 2 or 4. So what's the third one? Well, the third one is don't attack anybody. People don't like to vote for someone who's aggressive, someone who attacks. I can understand that. And what's the fourth? They said, okay, I'm completely, okay. Says, well, the fourth thing is someone attacks you, don't defend yourself. So I said, okay, I'm not going, please call the guys. I'm off, take me off the panel. And this is kind of was quite interesting because and this is what I'm trying to kind of mention in this initial minutes, which is that the chip with which we approach things from academia sometimes are very different from the ones with which we have to approach political communication, particularly when we're in a campaign. We're not talking about government. When we're in government, we need a theory, we need to understand, we need to know our stuff. But when you're in the campaign, that is to get to government, that's not the way you're going to communicate. So what's the story with you can't defend yourself when they attack you? So the guy says, look, someone attacks you. So if you defend yourself, so you get into the fight, first of all, you get into the same level of aggressivity of the person who's attacking you. But let's imagine that you win the debate. You'll win the debate. If you debate with this guy, you'll win the debate. People don't want to vote for people who are too smart. So your objective in the debate is not to win the debate. Your objective in the debate is to win votes. And not necessarily winning the debate is what brings you vote. So I say, well, so what do I do if they attack? I'm not going to sit there like nothing. Why don't you just put faces and kind of say, no, Argentina doesn't need this thing anymore, and you say something because you some kind of reaction you have to have. But that's it. So imagine how difficult it is. Imagine how difficult it is for an academic, which is accustomed to think about the problems, try to understand, try to explain the problems, to say suddenly you have to kind of leave that all that aside and try to communicate and connect with people from a completely different level, which is a level of empathy, it's a level of emotional connection, and so well, let me just put that as a start, as an introduction, okay, of the difficulties. I want to talk about 3 things in this talk. First is what I think are the main difficulty when you do public policy. I was for 6 years president of Banco Ciudad, as Guillermo mentioned. When I got into the bank was losing 200 million pesos a year. When I handed the bank in last year, it was making 1.3 billion. In fact, the turnaround that we did at the bank became a Harvard Business School case because it was kind of so surprising how in a couple of years you can do such a turnaround. So I've learned one lesson from those 6 years, and I'm going to tell you what that lesson is, which is the main difficulty of doing policy. Then I'm going to talk about what I think are the 3 ingredients you need to have an effective government. And there I'm going to refer not only to my experience in the bank, but also to our experience in governing the city of Buenos Aires over the last couple of years. And then I'm going to finalize with a comment on how to build legacy, how to make the things that you do persist over time, not be overturned, not be reverted, and so we'll get to that. So those are kind of the 3 main themes that I'm going to be touching. Okay, so what is the main lesson that I've learned? So the main lesson that I've learned is that doing public policy is very difficult. It's because when you are mastering public resources, and your objective is to put the state at the service of the population, of the general good. That means you have to take these resources and put them at the service of the population at large. But in order to do that, probably you have to fight a lot of interest groups which are somehow taking advantage of the state. And really what you do is very opaque. It's very difficult to monitor what you do in government. It's very difficult to follow, to assess if you're using the resources properly or not properly. So the main relevant thing is that you have to have the right values to actually push in the direction of putting the government at the service of the public good, because permanently you're going to be kind of pushed from all these different groups which want you to transform what's public and private. And you're doing this in a context where nobody's seeing you, nobody's watching you, because it's very difficult to monitor the state. So if you don't have if your values are not right, you're going to be pushed into something that is not what the state is and the government is intended to. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. For example, corruption is the main example. Corruption is something that happens which makes what's public into private. Private of whoever in the private sector is participating in that corruption, or private from the government officials which participate in that corruption. So there we see very clearly. But the main example that I want you to give, which is an example which doesn't involve money, so I think it's easier to see it, is that one of the main conflicts that we had that I had as president of Banco Ciudad is that when I went into the Banco Ciudad, the people who Banco Ciudad was a place which is very peculiar within the public sector, because the workers are bank employees, so they have a relatively high wage. They're public employees, but they are paid a relatively high wage. So who used to go to work to Banco Ciudad? Well, who used to go to work to Banco Ciudad was either the people who the politicians said, we want these people to work here. So it was political militants, people on which you had to pay back some kind of favor, and then you got them a job, people who had worked in the campaign, not that they were interested in banking or anything, but they were interested in having a job, particularly if it's a job where you can't fire them from, okay? So for many years, the people who came to work into this organization were these appointees, these political appointees by the political system, or the sons and daughters of the current employees. So this is also a way of transforming something that's public into private. Private of specific groups which somehow have a privilege in access resources from the state. So I told the mayor that this is a very minor example, but I think it's very symbolic, and I'm going to tell you a very funny story in a minute. It's I said, this is not the way the state works. The state has to work to provide equal opportunities, not to basically slot in these resources into these privileged groups. So the mayor said, fine, we're never from the political side, you're never going to be asked to get anybody into the bank from the political side. You deal with the guys at the bank. And so we decided to implement a system where the access was going to be fully meritocratic. So we kind of publish in the main newspapers that these were those openings. We typically had 20,000, 30,000 candidates. We selected according to their average, their GPA scores in the high school or in their universities, depending on the category. Then we selected the best 1,000 scores. They had to take an exam, and then we were left with, say, 100, 200, and then we gave privilege among those 200 to kids who were coming from the public educational system. So that was our system. So system totally geared to provide equal opportunity with a little bit notch of affirmative action there at the end. Well, I had 25 strikes. 25 strikes, I say, against equal opportunity. So I would call the union leader, which was an extreme left wing, and he says, you have to give me a quota for the workers here. And I say, I don't know if you realize that the workers here are all in the 10% richest of the population of Argentina, because they're bank employees with high wages, etc. So I thought you were from the left wing, and you're asking me for a quota for the rich. If you would have come and asked me, for example, for a quota from the guys from the best school GPAs from the shanty towns, I'm with you. But how can I'm going to accept that you come and ask me for a privilege for the rich? I mean, you thought that I was a kind of a center-right guy, and I'm Lenin compared with you. I'm Lenin. So the guys were completely kind of caught completely off balance. It was very funny because at the end they said, what am I going to do with this guy? How we're going to, because politically, internally in the bank, this was a very important issue. So they made me a 5-day strike, no? And when the strike ends, you know, having a bank closed for 5 days is pretty tough. So when the strike ends, I called the guy and said, Pepe, I'm going to ask you not to strike, to stop this strike. And he says, finally, you've heard. I said, yeah, I've heard the guys with the drums all week long. I mean, I have my head is exploding from the noise. But heard what? No, you're going to, okay, you're going to concede, and you're going to give this. No, this is a question of principle. I'm not going to concede anything. No, I'm asking you not to do a strike, to stop this strike, because I'm going to not pay the wages of the workers who go on strike. Because the Constitution is very clear. You have the right to strike, but the employer doesn't have the obligation to pay when you decide to use your right to strike. So I'm not going to, but don't worry, I don't want the money. You know, I'm not going to keep the money. That I'm not going to pay to the workers, I'm not going to keep the money. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to give it back, because this money is not yours, it's not mine, it's not of the mayor, it's of the people of the city of Buenos Aires. So we're going to return the money to the people of the city of Buenos Aires. And the guy was looking at me like saying, this guy has gone completely mad. He says, so I'm going to do is, I'm going to take this money and I'm going to buy X-ray equipments for the public hospitals in the city of Buenos Aires. But don't worry, I'm going to put a donation of employees of Banco Ciudad. Okay. Well, there was never again a strike. There was never again a strike at the bank. But nobody knew about this. Nobody knew. So you fight to provide equal opportunities. It's a benefit which is very diluted. The person you're benefiting doesn't even know what that person perhaps one day reads an ad in the newspaper, goes to apply for a job and gets the job because there wasn't someone privileged which basically was appointed before him, but they're not going to be there defending you. But at the same time, you have to be fighting with those interest groups, with the strikes which are trying to appropriate something from the state to privilege them. Is the idea clear? Yes, it's so extreme that once I got, and I finished with the story, I got 70 guys into the call center out of this process, and 3 months later they have the strike to have the sons and daughters come back in, and 20 guys out of the 70 go on strike. So I get on my car, I go to the call center, I get the 20 guys together, and I do the following thing. I get the chair of one of them, and so I get the chair, and then I throw the chair to where they were. So the guys are completely shocked. So I look at the guy who was the chair and say, look, you see this chair? This chair had a name. This chair had a name. This chair had been slotted to someone, and that someone, was not you. It so happens that it was not you. It was a son of an employee, it was a political appointee, but you're sitting in this seat because you deserve it, because you study, you're able, you went through the exam, you're the best. And I fought so that you are sitting there. Now, if you, who are the guy who benefited from my effort to provide equal opportunities, once you're in the system, are fighting so that I turn back and have a system of privilege, well, you see what the difficulty is. So the guys, they were all kind of completely shocked. And then one guy says, look, I think you're right. Let's do the following. My cousin gets in, and then we stop, okay? But I'm giving you the stories, and I'm spending a little bit of time with this because you're very much alone. You have to fight the interest groups, and you're alone. There's no one who's going to be defending, but the guys who are going to be affected by you taking the state and putting it to the service of the population, those are going to fight. And this is an idea that as people studying here, you may have heard about. There's a very famous economist called Mancur Olson, and he wrote a book in the 1960s called The Logic of Collective Action, and he describes exactly this process, the process of the fight between concentrated interest groups and the public good. And he basically said there's no chance. There's no chance that the public good wins, because when I had those 5 days of strike, I would get home completely exhausted, tired, the level of tension that you lived in the organization. And my wife says, Federico, is this worth it? Why are you doing this? Nobody knows. Nobody cares. And I said, no, I'm doing this because this is in what I believe. And this is the reason I came here, to change things, so that things work in a different way. So that's my lesson. That's my difficulty. You're going to find this all over in whatever thing you do in public policy. You're going to be fighting alone to defend the public good, and you're going to be fighting a lot of people who are vocal, who are aggressive, because typically money is involved, and you're taking away from them those money because you want to put it at the service of the state. So that's kind of my main lesson. So that's my first point about the difficulties. The second is, what do you need to do to have a good government? And I think this is a dish which needs 3 ingredients. You need to combine 3 ingredients. It's not sufficient with one of them. You need the 3. And the first one has to do with what I was mentioning before, which is values. You have to be sure, and you have to know what you're doing there and why you're doing and who you're working for, which again, I repeat, is the public good. But this has to be absolutely strong, because in the first minute, you're going to be challenged to deviate from the public good in many different ways. The unions, corruption, etc. So you need values. If you don't have values, there's no way you're going to have an effective government, because immediately the objective of the government is going to be deviated into different things. So that's the first thing. Now, it's not sufficient with values, because good values a lot of people have, but that doesn't mean they will be good. They will be able to run a good government. Most of people have good values. So you need a second ingredient, and the second ingredient, I call it, it's audacia. Audacia in English would be audacia in English. Boldness. Boldness. Boldness means that you have to have the capacity of thinking out of the box and to thinking in a different way, because what you need to do is to transform those values into action. You need to transform values into action, and that means that you have to have good teams, and you have to be able to think in a creative way. So let me give you an example that we had in the city of Buenos Aires. Over the last 40 years, most of the mayors were mostly concerned about how to make life easier for cars. So how do you build a highway so that people can move and go into the downtown in an easier way, and parking spaces, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then people didn't ask this very simple question, which was, well, most of the people, how do they come here? Well, most of the people here come with public transportation. Well, let's forget about the car. The car is not, let's fight the car. And let's basically focus on public transportation. And this, which may sound a little bit silly or a bit simple, for 40 years had not been done. And we suddenly decided to do it, because what's the value? The value is we want to improve the way people live, the way people travel. Okay, focus where the problem is. And so we decided to design a whole new system of public transportation in the city of Buenos Aires, which of course is inspired in the Transmillennium of Bogota, the bus system in Curitiba and many different places. It's becoming more popular all over the place, which is basically you create like a subway system on ground for buses. And this was completely thinking out of the box. And people say, well, what happens with the car? I don't care about what happens with the car. But 80% of the people travel in this system. For example, we did one of these systems which covered the main avenue in the city of Buenos Aires. We call the Avenue 9th of July. And just doing that, people saved 1 hour per day. 100,000 people ended up saving 1 hour of transportation per day by having this new bus transit system. So you need, now doing that implied that we had to study each square meters of the avenue in order to make sure how we're going to build and construct the system. So you need to have the boldness to think in a way which is different from what people were thinking for 40 years. Sometimes you have to change the paradigm, and then you have to have the teams which can actually transform values into something actual, a real policy prescription. So values and boldness to transform values into a policy prescription. But that's not enough. You can have the right values, and you can have the teams and the boldness to think about things. You may not be successful. So you need the third ingredient. And the third ingredient is courage. Why courage is important? Because anything you do in public policy, you're not going to benefit everybody. There's going to be people who are going to feel that they're threatened, or they actually lose from the move, or you're going to have people which just for political reasons are going to attack you. And then you have to be able to hold up the pressure of the criticism to actually bring things to a conclusion. So let me give you another example. We definitely had that in the case of this bus transit system. Everybody was opposed to it because in the mid suddenly you kind of turn around the main avenue in the city of Buenos Aires, and traffic is a complete chaos, and people don't understand how the system is going to work. So we had lots of criticisms, and we went away. But the main example I want to give you about courage has to do with education. So when the current Minister of Education is appointed in the city of Buenos Aires, the mayor says, give me your analysis, your diagnosis of the system of the public educational system in the city of Buenos Aires. And then the minister says, yes, the problem is that it's privatized. And the mayor says, no, I know that half of the kids in the city of Buenos Aires go to private schools, but I'm asking you about the public educational system. So the minister looks at him and says, yes, the problem is that it's privatized. And the mayor says, no, you're not understanding me. I know that within the public educational system, we have schools which are financed by the state but are run by local cooperatives which are kind of privately run, even though state financed. I'm asking you about the public schools. The schools that we are paying and that we are running. What do you think is the main problem there? And then the minister says they are privatized. So the guy says, what are you talking about? And certainly there's something I'm missing here. I'm not understanding something. And the minister says, yeah, they're privatized. They're privatized to the unions. What do you mean? Well, when you look at the way the schools are run, there's something what's called juntas de clasificación, it's an institution which defines who promotes in the educational system, who becomes a director of a school, who becomes a school inspector, who becomes a teacher with more seniority. And that junta de clasificación is run by the unions. So who do you think the teacher is going to respond to? Is it going to respond to the state, or is it going to respond to the unions? Well, it's obvious. It's going to respond to the unions. So the guys who became the school directors were not the best teachers, but were the most active unionists. So the whole educational system was a permanent political fight, lots of strikes, and people were leaving the public educational system into the private educational system, because parents care about the education of their kids, and the first thing they want is their kids to have school. So, because what are the values? The values is that the public educational system is a key factor to have a society with equal opportunity, which is more egalitarian. We want a society with a very strong public educational system. So that's the value. So we need to transform that into actions. And the action is, well, this is the diagnosis. This is a particular group of people who have taken over the educational system for their own benefit and not for the benefit of the state. So that's the boldness. And that implied a change in what we call the Estatuto Docente, which is the way, the laws which rule the teachers' union, which had not been changed in 50 years. So that's the boldness. We have to change this. So we decided to pass a law, to propose a law to the city legislature, which reformed these juntas de clasificación. And for 6 months, we basically had the school system taken over by the unions and by the students, mobilized by the unions. So basically had for 6 months no schools in the city of Buenos Aires. And that's where I say you need the courage. You need the courage to say, I'm going to stick because I believe in this, and in spite of the opposition, I'm going to take it to completion. So finally, after 6 months of fight, on December 1, we actually got the law passed. And then the mayor decided to do something else, which was kind of surprising, because he said, similar to what I mentioned before in Banco Ciudad, we're not paying to workers. That's not the main thing we do every day, but in spite of what it seems from this talk, he said, I'm not going to pay the wages of all the workers which were on strike. So all the days that the teachers were on strike, I'm not going to pay the wages, because the same reasoning. I mean, I'm not going to finance the strike of the public educational system with the money of the taxpayers of the city of Buenos Aires. And what happened is that after that, meaning you have your values, you have your ideas, you bring them to completion, there was never again a strike in the public educational system in the city of Buenos Aires. And people today are going back from the private educational system to the public educational system. It's the only place in the Argentine Republic where the public educational system is actually growing, and now it's actually growing faster and faster every year. This year we had a tremendous increase in the amount of people who move from the private educational system to the public educational system. And I think that sometimes you have magic happening, and what happened is that why there weren't any strikes after that? Because teachers, in reality, they don't want to strike. Most of the teachers in the public, the big majority, almost everybody, they are deeply passionate about what they do, and they're deeply committed to the public educational system. But if the strike is free for them, meaning they don't pay any cost, because after striking you get your wage paid, what excuse do they have with the unions to say that they're not going to participate in the strike? They don't have an argument. So when we decided that we were not going to pay the same wage to someone who went on strike than someone that didn't go on strike, they started having an excuse. So they could go to the union and say, look, I'm not going to strike because I need my wage. Perhaps they were not that interested in their wage of that particular day, but they had an argument with which they could defend what they really believed in, and it's that the kids in the public school system had to have classes. So we changed dramatically not only the relationship of power between the state and the unions, but between the teachers and the union, in a way that turned out to be tremendously effective and beneficial for the public educational system. But you see the combination. You need the three ingredients. You need the values to say, I want to develop the public educational system. I need to have a good team which tells me what I need to do, even though it means doing something that nobody has dared to do in the last 50 years. And then you need to have the courage to follow through in spite of all the opposition. In the case of course, you don't know the story, but it's difficult to transmit what is to have basically for 6 months, the public educational system basically intervened. The schools were taken by the students. This was in the news all the time. They say, I truly believe in this. If you are going to turn around at the first voice that complains, you'll never get anything done. And I'm not saying that you're always going to be right, but I'm going to say you're never going to get anything done because there's always going to be people complaining. Okay? So those are the three ingredients that you need to have an effective government: values, boldness, and courage. And you need the three, and the three are different, and the three are necessary ingredients. So let me finish, and then so we leave some time for the Q&A. Guillermo, you asked me to do as much as possible about that with legacy. How do you manage that the things that you do persist over time? And this is a huge challenge. Because remember, what did Mancur also say? It says, if you actually manage to put the state at the service of people, those interest groups are always going to be there. And they're waiting for you to leave so that they can jump immediately over the spoils of the state very quickly. So it's a permanent thing. So how do you build the legacy? And I had this question in Argentina. For those of you who know a bit more about Argentina, we always say that we're kind of in a pendulum, no? Like things don't have persistence. We go in one direction, and then the guy that comes next kind of moves exactly in the opposite direction. Kind of things don't have persistence. They don't build and don't become permanent, no? And there was a country which has some similarities with Argentina, which is Australia. I don't know if there's anybody here from Australia. Which is a country which has a lot of things which were very similar to Argentina. I was telling Guillermo that up to 1975, the growth path of Argentina and Australia were very similar, up to 1975. In the early 1980s, the Australians elect a union leader as president, a guy called Bob Hawke. And Bob Hawke chooses as finance minister a very young guy who had not finished high school and who was the son of, you know, those guys who carry the sacks in the port? You know, like in the 1960s, you still had that job that the people were carrying. So the son of a very poor family from Sydney was elected finance minister. That guy was called Paul Keating. And they decided to do a huge turnaround of the Australian economy. They opened up the economy to the world. They deregulated the labor market. They privatized. They did a whole a series of reforms, perhaps a little bit surprising from someone who was coming from the labor market, but that really kind of put Australia on a growth path which was very sustainable. The policies were sustained by the governments which followed. They won 4 elections, but after that there was a change in the political side of the government and the policies were not challenged. And Australia recovered its preeminence among the 4 or 5 or 6 richest countries in the world, where it was not at the beginning of the 1980s. It had really slid down quite a bit. So I always had this question, how did these guys manage to do these policies and that the policies stick? Whereas in Argentina, we can never make anything stick. And I was a good friend of the Australian ambassador in Argentina, so he said, why don't you go and ask these guys? If you have this question, the best thing is go and ask. So there I went to Australia to interview these guys and ask them this: how do you build legacy? And I had an interview of 4 hours with Paul Keating, which was absolutely amazing. And after we talked a lot of things, and he was very interested about Argentina. He had a very famous speech when he was finance minister saying, look, we have to do a lot of things, if not we'll end up like Argentina. So he was kind of interested in learning a bit more about Argentina. Apparently it scared the Australians quite a bit, okay, the prospect. And so I asked him, how do you make the things that you propose stick and persist? I says, oh no, that's very easy. They stick because we were honest people. So certainly that's a necessary condition, but I kind of asked him to elaborate a bit more on this idea. And he said, look, it's very simple. When you are a team of honest people, you're going to do a lot of mistakes because it's impossible not to make a lot of mistakes. But because you're really thinking in the public good, you'll probably do more rights than wrongs. You'll have more things that you do right than things that you do wrong. So over the time, you're actually going to be approaching policies which are beneficial for the population. Of course, when you look at the thing in a historical perspective, it seems like everything was kind of very linear and very simple and very methodic. But he said, for me, doing policy in the beginning of the 1980s in Australia was like climbing up a mountain. They give me one ski, and they say, now go down. And when I got home at night every day, I felt like I had come down the mountain with one ski, just to get an idea, no? So, but you're going to be kind of moving in the right direction, and that over time is going to build up in the right direction. So that's the first thing. You're thinking in the public good if you're honest people. Then the second thing, there are no leaks. If you run an honest government, the money that comes in from the taxpayers go into public goods and public services, and there are no leaks. So the money kind of gets its value for it. So that helps a lot as well. But that's really not the important thing. You know what the important thing is? The important thing is that when people believe in you, people think that you're honest, people think that you're well-intentioned, people trust you. They trust you. And when they trust you, they are not going around saying, oh, now we have to turn around this. They just buy the thing and people move on. And that gives you a lot of margin and a lot of room to do policy. And this is what we had. Of course, we had Bob Hawke, which was a very famous union leader, and he had a lot of credibility, and that made things very easy. But this trust of society in the policymaker is the only way to build legacy. And I'm going to give you, given that I'm from Argentina, two examples from Argentina. So this happens in all societies. An example of how you don't build legacy and how you build legacy. And the example where you don't is my preferred example, is that in the 1990s, the president which ran Argentina during most of the 1990s, which was called Carlos Menem, he did a lot of the reforms which are very similar to the reforms that Australia had done 5 or 6 years before. And I think from a technical point of view, were excellent reforms, but they have all been overturned in the last 10 years, or most of them have been overturned. And my preferred example is the airline. You know, we have a national airline called Aerolíneas Argentinas. No country in Latin America has a national airline. For example, in Brazil, when Varig went bankrupt in 2005, and they went to ask José Ignacio da Lula, the president of Brazil, to put state money to finance the airline, he kicked the guys out of their office. Says, you're telling me I have to tax the Brazilian taxpayers to finance the airline that the rich use? Just get out of here, okay? This is kind of absolutely ridiculous, okay? This is something that the top segment of the population in these countries uses the airline. So having a national airline means taxing the poor to give to the rich. So it doesn't sound like a very good policy to me. It sounds something very... so that was privatized in the 1990s, and then when Cristina Fernández de Kirchner decides to nationalize the company, 84% of the Argentines agreed with the president. They wanted the company to become national again. And this company is today, it costs us billions of dollars of taxpayers' money. And of course, you can imagine if that 84%, if only 10% of the population used the airline, that means that there were 74% of the people who agreed with the policy, even though that they were going to not receive any benefit from the policy, and they're going to pay for this. So it's kind of a little bit kind of incomprehensible. So that was a policy that did not persist. And you know why? because there was the strong feeling in the population that the company had been privatized because there was a corruption objective behind. That in the sale, the government officials have received money, and people, when people think that that's the motivation for policy, they rebel. They don't want that. They don't want the situation to persist. They want things to change, even though if it moves in their own, not in their own benefit. So if you don't do things in a way that society trusts that you're doing it for the public good, people are going to be asking all the time for that policy to be changed. So that's kind of, I give that example because it's so absurd that people actually support that policy, and that's why I think it's a good example. Let me give you the example of why you can actually do the change. In Argentina, for many, many years, between 1930 and in the late 1970s, whenever the government was not doing very well, the Argentines caught up with a very crazy idea that perhaps if the military took over, they could do a better government. To be honest, I think it's an insane thought. I mean, guys who are not trained to run government, which have absolutely no experience, you're going to give them to run the government. And on top of that, they have guns. I mean, it's kind of a completely crazy idea. But for 45 years, the Argentines had that idea, which today our generation cannot understand. We just cannot understand. And in 1983, we had a president called Raúl Alfonsín, and who was the first president of our new democratic regime. And he was a disaster from an economic point of view. He was a complete disaster. But he came to Argentina to convince the Argentines that democracy was the right way to govern ourselves, and that was a system that was within which it was worth living. And he was a very credible leader for Argentina in that respect. People are completely convinced that this person came because he was totally convinced that this was best for the country. And that's our successful story, because after 1983, no Argentine ever questioned the idea of democracy again. In fact, we just can't understand what the Argentines thought was the solution before 1983. So if you want to build legacy, you have to start building your credibility. And you have to build the trust. And the trust is going to come exclusively from the fact that people are totally convinced, which can only happen if you're truly loyal and sincere in the fact that you're working for the public good. Which, remember, I said at the beginning, was the most difficult thing, because you're all the time being pressed to move in different directions. So let me just summarize what I've just said, and then we stop and we open, Guillermo, if you think, for the Q&A. So my first idea was the difficulties of government, which this is thing that you're being pushed around all the time, and that you're alone, and there's no one going to defend you in your quest for looking and fighting for the public good. Then we talked about the three things that you need for effective government, which were values, boldness, and courage. I'll give you a couple of examples. And then trust and honesty as a way of building some legacy from what you actually did in government. So let me stop there and be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you very much, Federico. Fascinating presentation. Listening to you, I'm more and more with Master also. It's an impossible task. And one point that you highlighted is the role of values. And in order to talk to people before you are elected, and then to talk to people so
After.
that they continue following the policies that you have enacted. And Now, in the middle of that, I mean, there are other things. There are shocks that come from the rest of the world, and we are living in a world where that is constantly happening. So I wonder if, certainly I'm sure that you will consider that as an important factor, but more to the point, whether having an economist dealing with these issues with perhaps a better understanding of the mechanics of certain things, of the role of certain institutions like the banks, that for people is just enemy number one, and how they work and what they mean, whether you feel that, and you have run a bank, so whether having an economist in charge of a bank, a well-trained economist, makes a big difference. And there are many other questions that I would have about that. But the second sort of set of questions have to do with how many people do you need that share your views in order for this to be carried out effectively. I remember in the case of Argentina that years ago we thought about what would be needed when the democracy came back. People started to ask themselves, how many people do we need in government with, of course, decent people, but with good training? And at the time it was, at least you need 100 guys. And it was very difficult to find 100 guys who were well trained in Argentina at the time. And so, but the point is, you need some cohesion of the views, people who share your views. And I mean, maybe you have some reflections about that. But I don't want to monopolize and have you just answer.
Maybe we take a couple of questions and.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was going to plan. To open up the floor for more questions, and then I'll give Federico a chance to start answering. Identify yourself, if you don't mind.
Thank you very much. It was a very informative talk. My name is Tamim. I'm doing economic policy here, and I'm from Afghanistan. I work for the government there. And what you told me brought the experience that I and a few others went through. I remember specifically the chairman of the Senate of Afghanistan used to send messages to ministers that I worked that hire my brother here, otherwise I will, impeach you or something. But I have two questions, and the first question is how do you fight these interest groups? How do you kind of counter them? Because you can incentivize, take their salaries one way or another, but that's one tool. Sometimes they're very strong, especially in violent societies. So yeah. That's first question. And the second question is, I think it's a follow-up to Professor Calvo's question, is a lot of times these technocrats, economists, scientists, when they reach the public office, they feel very alone. They don't have that critical mass to support them. In the experience of Afghanistan right now, there is a Columbia alumni who's running for the president of Afghanistan. He might win the election, but the problem is he doesn't have that critical mass to support him. He feels very alone, and the rest is just typical warlords who are running for different jobs. Thank you.
Alma, you want this one? Okay.
Your talk was fascinating. I have a specific question. How did Argentine policymakers get out of the hold of Peronism and move to macroeconomic policymaking that is aimed at balancing the budgets at various levels, city, state, and the federal government? Was it the massive debt default of 2001 and the legal battles with the creditors, the holdout creditors? Did the policymakers say enough is enough? Was there a shock treatment?
Okay.
Thank you. My name is Alfonso Diaz. I come from the Transmilenio town originally. And somehow, although I acknowledge that this might take another seminar, even a full day seminar, but applying your notions, there's three notions of the three keys for success. In retrospect, how would you evaluate three situations, in my view, probably the three most important moments, even if they lasted different terms in the recent Argentinian history? That is the convertibility law and the disregard for full employment or anything close to full employment. I recall attending a Cavallo's road show, and he was lionized as the great hero by the Wall Street Journal types, even though at that time the Wall Street Journal was not as much as at the right as it is today. Second, the mega cambiazo, and I understand you yourself were somehow involved or even touched by that decision. When Cavallo 2.0 applied that policy or throw that life saver. And third, what the professor had just said, but with a different twist, the Lavagna's, because correct me if I am wrong, I actually think that it was he himself who is more responsible, call him a hero or a villain or in between, as I probably should call him. Do you think that it was all those guys who were predicting Armageddon, were not they totally wrong by the events? True, you can say, there was the commodity boom, there was the Chavez effect, which I understand was not that big. Please.
Entendido.
Okay.
Una más y una más y después hacemos
You have a question? Go ahead. No, go ahead. Hopefully it's a short one.
Yeah.
Please.
Thanks so much for that presentation. I'm from Argentina myself. Pick this up. I am particularly concerned about my country, and I share a lot of your views. So my question is, we've gone through the good path sort of thing in the 90s, and I would like to see the country go back to that and hopefully for it to stick. What do you feel is going to take for the country to return to that path? Is it going to be hitting rock bottom, or is it going to be a particular type of leader, a charismatic leader who has that drive? What in your view is it going to take?
Okay. So let me start. I think there are kind of two big themes here, which is about how do you build a government, the people, how do people kind of align themselves with your objective, which is a little bit the first two questions. And then I think more specific questions about Argentina and Argentina's history, particularly, and Peronism. We haven't gotten rid of Peronism yet, but I'll get to that in a minute. And you've probably all heard about Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt is a political scientist, I think, and there's a beautiful movie called Hannah Arendt, which basically describes her experience when she went as a reporter of the New York Times to the trial of Eichmann, which was a Nazi official, and basically when she goes to the trial, she's completely surprised by this guy. This is a mediocre. It's a guy which is completely mediocre. This is the guy who basically ran the train system into Auschwitz. And the guy says, look, I'm not anti-Semitic, I didn't kill anybody, they just told me that I had to run these trains, and I ran these trains, but I disagree completely with what was happening. So she kind of thought very deeply about this situation, and she wrote a book which is called, in Spanish, called La Banalidad del Mal. I don't know if someone can help me with the title in English.
Of evil.
The Banality of Evil, that's the title in English. And she said, this is something, what this person was doing was, he was banalizing, no, he was not giving the importance to really what was going on. He was looking the other way around. Why do I tell you this? Because if I would have to think about kind of the public officials, now imagine the public officials like a whole circle, okay? It's the public officials. You have perhaps 10% which are corrupt, which are in the business of corruption. I mean, they're in the business of actually putting together the schemes so that they can steal from the government. Then you have probably 3%, which are the guys who feel that their task is to fight those guys. To fight. To go and chase those guys and cut their corners and kind of trap them. 3%. No, 10, 3, there's a bunch in the middle, okay? Well, the bunch in the middle is what I call the banality of corruption. And those are the guys who are honest, which I think are the majority, but they say, look, the system is this way, and they look the other way. And they hope that nobody kind of bother them so that they can do their work and that they can devote themselves to the public good. But they don't feel they can be heroes, or they don't want to be heroes, and they look the other way around. So 3, 87, and 10. So the challenge is how, it's not a question of how many, the question is how do you actually get all those guys which are honest to work to fight the other 10. And so it's a very optimistic, in some sense, message that I want to give, but it really requires, you must have recognized from my talk that I think there's some importance in the leader. Because when I tell you the story of Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, it was really the leader providing the trust that society needs in order to actually make a move in some direction. So in the case of Afghanistan, well, what I'm saying is you have a lot of potential allies. Most of the people want to live the life of good values, not of bad values. That's the great majority. So the question is, how do you rally them to actually work to fight? And probably it's true that you need a little bit of critical mass of the fighters. You need a little bit of critical mass of the fighters, probably that's true. But the main challenge is how do you transform all those big bunch of people which are honest and well-intentioned to work and come to your aid and to be your allies. And well, I think that the leader or the leaders have an important part in rallying that support. So it's much broader than just having a bunch of technocrats. A bunch of technocrats alone cannot do anything. Somehow you have to transmit a much broader sense of purpose and of change that you're doing. It's much, much broader. And so that's and certainly that is not going to be done by a technocrat. It's going to be done by someone who inspires, who connects with you from an emotional point of view. Then, of course, remember I said, then you need the boldness and you need the teams to know what you have to do, which is your question about an economist at a bank. Because I'm saying values, I'm saying boldness, teams, to transform values into action, you need to have technical expertise. So the technical expertise is a key ingredient, but just one of the ingredients. It's not sufficient. Okay? Going to the questions of Peronism. Peronism is a great. It's a very well. Peronism is everything. There was a very famous famous phrase of Juan Domingo Perón in the 1950s says, well, in Argentina we have the conservatives, and then we have the socialists, and then we have the radicals, and we have this, and we have that. And then a journalist was interviewing, and the Peronists, oh no, all are Peronists. They're all Peronists, okay? We're all Peronists. So we definitely haven't gotten rid of the Peronism, and nor has the Peronism changed its ways. In fact, in the 1990s, where you had the Peronism is also a fantastic thing that it runs the country for a decade. It brings us to a crisis, and then supposedly they don't have anything to do with it. They say, no, those were the wrong Peronists, no? We are the right Peronists, so now you have to vote for us. And it's amazing. They can do that. They can transform themselves and reinvent themselves all the time. But for in the 1990s, which was more like a more right-wing Peronism, and we ended up with a huge debt crisis because certainly the budget deficit continued to increase. It was not financed with inflation, it was financed with debt. You run into a debt crisis. And in the 2000s, we have exactly the same. In spite of an initial period in which the fiscal situation became stronger, over the last 5 or 6 years, we had a huge increase in fiscal deficit, which is financed like in the 70s and in the 80s with the inflation tax. So we don't see that there has been a change of the cycle in that respect, no? And that takes me to that. Before going to the specifics of the different, that we say how do you turn? Where was the gentleman who asked the question? How do you turn things around? And well, I think a little bit with the ingredients that I was mentioning before, with a government which finally convinces the Argentines that you're really working for the public good. That's why our approach to I'm from a particular political party, and our approach to the elections next year is that over the last 30 years, Argentina has been governed by two parties, which is the Peronists and the Radicals, but they share the same matrix of government, which is this matrix of having the state not at the service of the public good, but at the service of all these interest groups which feed themselves from the state. And that this is what needs to be changed. That's our message. And we think we have the experience in the city of Buenos Aires to show that that has been changed. In the same way that in Uruguay, you had a party which for 2 periods governed the city of Montevideo, which was a party which was an outsider, and then people say, well, let's give these guys a chance, because they look that they're different. Or the PT in Brazil, that for many years they governed Sao Paulo before people said, well, maybe we can give these guys a chance to see if we can try something different. And then whether that Argentina will change or not will depend on doing the right policies, doing the policies with credibility, with trust from the population, probably having a little bit of luck, and there's no magic. You know, I always say it's always hard work and doing the things right for a long period of time, which actually takes me to the question, the more specific question about the details of what has happened in Argentina over the last 2 decades. For example, in the 1990s, we were coming from a period of very high inflation, hyperinflation in the 1980s. We decided to stop the hyperinflation with fixing the exchange rate, and then tying everything to the fixed exchange rate. So the message from the technocrats to the politicians was, look, if you change this, because all the institutional framework was tied to the exchange rate. For example, all the public services were transformed into dollars. We had, the system 1 peso, $1. You had all the financial sector completely exposed to a devaluation. So you would change the devaluation, the whole financial sector would collapse. So it's like a bomb. You set up a bomb. It says, don't change this, because if one day you change this, the cost is going to be. It's a strategy, perhaps kind of. When we look at it in retrospect, it was kind of it was very extreme as a way of actually compromising the political class into actually kind of ordering itself and running a more reasonable fiscal policy. It is true also that Argentina had a little bit of bad luck because towards 2001, a lot of you were talking about external conditions were very bad for Argentina, and perhaps one of the big bet in 2001 was, let's try to hold this for a while. External situation will change, and we don't want to break the whole institutional framework that Argentina has built, because that's going to bring us back in a lot of dimensions. And that's kind of the rationale of when the De la Rúa government, I was part of that government, and the president used to call us up and say, when he was not asleep, and he would say, look, there was an election and there were two candidates. One which said, let's devalue, and I said that no, we were going to stick to the institutional framework, and people voted for this. So now, guys, do whatever you need to do to comply with the popular mandate in the vote, no? And the megacanje, which you mentioned, was one way of pushing payments forward to actually kind of buy time in order to survive, and so it's a completely normal financial transaction. And then when you had finally that system did not hold up, and you had finally the devaluation at the beginning of 2002. The devaluation did something that we've studied a lot in our story, and particularly because there's a very famous Argentine economist which studied the Argentine economy, called Carlos Díaz Alejandro, and he used to say that large devaluations, they have a redistributive effect. The big effect of the devaluations is a redistributive effect. In the case of Díaz Alejandro, he used to think that that was a very bad thing, because you kind of moved the rent to the land owners, and that they all went to spend the money in Paris, and spent great time in Paris and things like that. But in 2002, 2003, when you had the devaluation, what really happened is that you transferred the income from workers to the firms, and then you had an investment boom. So you improve the cash flow of firms, and then you increase the savings rate. The savings rate of Argentina moved from 14% of GDP to 26% of GDP in 3 years. And so suddenly you have firms with a lot of cash, firms investing a lot, the economy picking up in its sustainable growth path. It's a path with a current account surplus, not with where investment is being financed by current account deficit or with foreign savings. And it turned out to be a very sustainable. I was a big fan of. I was very much afraid of how we were going to exit convertibility, but that turned out to be a very successful in terms of producing a sustainable growth path, and it was actually combined at the beginning of the 2000s with a very strong fiscal surplus. So in fact, and this is where you mentioned Lavagna. I mean, he was very influential in actually building a large fiscal surplus. So if you are in 2005 in Argentina, you say, here you have a country which has doubled its savings rate, has doubled its investment rate. It's not building up external vulnerabilities. It has a fiscal surplus. Boy, you could really be optimistic. And in fact, there was a complete blossoming of new activities in Argentina, software, the wine industry, the agricultural sector, in the first half of the 2000s. And unfortunately, in the last year of Néstor Kirchner, and then throughout the whole presidency of Cristina Fernández Kirchner, we've kind of gone back to the old policies of trying to keep up economic growth with expansionary fiscal and monetary policies, and we know that has a very short, that's not sustainable growth, that has a very short growth span, and which has taken Argentina to a situation where over the last 4 or 5 years it has been completely stagnant. We have today the same level of income that we had at the end of 2011 when Cristina Fernández was reelected, with a high inflation, lots of bottlenecks, exchange rate controls. Let me just finish with one something I was telling Guillermo and Sara before coming here. You remember that there was a note on Argentina in The Economist a couple of weeks ago. Maybe some of you saw it. It's called the Argentine Parable, and this was kind of a country which for 100 years has not worked. And so I wrote a letter to The Economist, which they published, saying that I had a completely different view. of the Argentine history. And my view is the following. If you compare Argentina with Taiwan or Hong Kong, probably you'll find that Argentina grew less. But the only statement you're saying is that Argentina is not one of the countries that grew most in the 20th century. Because we know Taiwan and Hong Kong are among the countries that grew most. So I think that's a standard which is too high. Okay, fine, you're saying that, I agree. Argentina, you can't say that it's a failed society because it was not the highest growing society in the world. So let's compare Argentina with Australia and the US. And when you compare Argentina with Australia and the US, you see that up to 1975, the relative income level was basically the same. There was no relative decline of Argentina, perhaps a little bit, but nothing just kind of to say, oh, this is a failed society. And if you look from 1990 up till today, again you have that Argentina has recovered relative income relative to Australia and the US. So Argentina is not a failed society, actually. It's actually a society which had 15 years between 1975 and 1990 where Argentina imploded, virtually imploded. In those 15 years, Argentina passed from having an income which was 50% of that of the US to having an income which was 25% that of the US. So basically, in relative terms, it fell to half its level. No? Then it has been recovering from 1990 until now. Just so that you get an idea, if Argentina in between 75 and 1990 would have grown at the same rate it grew between 1930 and 75, for those who know a little bit more about Argentine history, it's not what we consider a great period of our economic growth. But let me extrapolate that growth rate to the period 75-90 and then kind of leave what happened afterwards. We would have today the level of income of Germany, so that you get an idea of the implication of those 15 years. What is the problem of Argentina is that the current government is repeating everything that we did wrong in those 15 years. And the result is the same. We have basically had 5 or 6 years of complete economic stagnation, and it has not been worse because we have fantastic terms of trade, and we had an agricultural boom over the last 15, 20 years, which have changed completely the scenery in terms of the capacity of Argentina of generating exports. But if not, the result would have been equally disastrous. Now, the good thing that is happening this year in Argentina is that it's the first time that what I think we would call it, according to the terminology of Dornbusch and Edwards, this populist cycle. It's the first time that the government which implements the populist policies, I think short-run policies is perhaps a better name, has to pay the consequences. Because typically what happens with populist governments is that they run the upswing, and whenever you have to pay the price of your policies, a new government comes in and pays all the cost. Well, this is the first time that the current government, which is the one which did the populist policies, is paying the cost of adjusting and correcting its own policies. I think that's going to be, I think that is something which makes us be very optimistic in terms that the society will be able to read in a much more intelligent and a much more objective way the results of these policies, and probably it will impact on the vote next year, and people vote finally for something which is different.
Well, I realize that we run out of time, but if you have an urgent question and short question, I'll be happy to take it.
Bueno.
Okay.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Federico.
Thank you.